Hello world, good morning and welcome back. Today I'm so excited. We actually have an episode that is all about innovation. And this is, after all, the Founders and Innovators morning show. So today I'm so excited to be here with Craig, who is an innovation coach from Soapbox Rocket. And he's going to talk to us all about how we can all be better innovators. So Craig, even just start by telling us, why an innovation coach? Why is this something that's so important?
I think I realized a long time ago, I'm probably never going to be the smartest person in the room. And so I take it kind of the same as sports, right? The coach is not the person best at playing the game. The coach is the person that's best at getting the people that are good at playing the game to do even better. And I think in particular, especially team sports and innovation, it's about how all the parts work together. So if you have a team and it doesn't matter what you're really good at, if you perform at your top, but it doesn't line up with how everybody else performs, then you just have a one-man show that's going to fail. You're going to get beat by somebody else that understands how do we take our best components and make a better team rather than just a team built around one player.
Mm-hmm. So tell us more about this, because sometimes I know when people are thinking about innovation, creativity, they think of it as a kind of solo sport. It's something that you're doing all by yourself, like a hermit locked up in a room, and suddenly you have this eureka moment and there's the bright light bulb. But I think your approach is innovation doesn't really work like that at all. And even just this idea that there might be several parts or components to innovation that we have to put together, that to me is just a whole different perspective on what innovation is all about. So tell us how you approach that.
Yeah. So first off, I think it's always important, to upfront define innovation. Because a lot of times I agree with you. A lot of people think, oh, innovation just means something technology or something new, something cool. But really, for me, the simplest definition of innovation is something new or a combination of old parts to create new value. So it's ultimately the goal of innovation for any group, individual, however you want to look at it, should be the creation of value. Now, that value can come in different forms. Sometimes it's for a customer. Sometimes it's for the business itself. So you can innovate on your own products to reduce your costs and create value for the company. Or you can, by reducing your own costs, you can reduce your price and create value for your customer. So it can go to multiple levels. But in the end, for me, it's that we sometimes, and I think you kind of alluded to this, we kind of sometimes confuse invention with innovation. And we all do know the lone inventor in the garage toiling away, where innovation is all about taking what that inventor has invented and delivering it to return value to some group of individuals. You can argue that you could do innovation for an individual, but it's difficult to scale value for one individual. When the goal is ultimately for all of us, we want to maximize value. Sometimes that's maximizing return. Sometimes that's maximizing some other metric, but it's all about return. For me, it's all about the creation and the return of value.
I love this focus on value. And I totally hear what you're saying too, that sometimes we can think about innovation for individuals. It's one of the ways that I try to approach my own life. I'm trying to be innovative, let's say, in terms of my fitness regimen or in terms of my journaling practice. And that definitely brings value to me. But you're right that there's no way that I could ever turn that into a business. So if our goals are actually to create a business, I totally hear what you're saying, that we really do have to focus on the values we can bring to ideally a wide number of other people. So tell us how you go about doing that in your work as an innovation coach. How do you help people think about how they can come up with new ways to create and produce values?
Yeah, well, I mean, funny enough, when we talk about individuals and groups of people, for the most part, I focus on design thinking, which is a human-centered design process. Now, I think there are good ways of balancing individual with human or user-centered. You do need to have an individual in mind, and that could be a composite individual. But it's again, for me, it's having that user, and that's how I help companies. Is let's identify the user. What are her, what are her values, and what are her pains and her gains, and that's where you're going to be able to create the most return for both, for the business and for the individual. And of course that works, it works differently if you're talking about a startup who is building. I mean, I always look at it this way: is businesses are a machine of return and innovation. And somewhere at startup, you're probably 90% innovation, 10% return, or the other business component of that business engine. And somewhere along the lines, it starts sliding and flips, where eventually it's 10% innovation and 90% return, business returns. And but it's cyclical as well. No company can survive with 10% innovation or less. I've worked with companies that are less than that. And so that's where I tend to come in with those companies is, okay, you guys are the best at whatever you do, but how do you now grow that? How do you innovate for your customer segment? Do you even understand who your customer segment is? And this is where I think startups do this as well, but big companies for sure do this. They say, oh, our target audience is easy. It's a male between 20 and 40 years old, and they're married and they have 2 kids. And my first question is, perfect. Find me a male that's 20 to 40 years old. You'll never find it. They might find a 32-year-old male, but he's not 20 to 40. And so that's where you've got to step back from those demographics and now go back to individuals. Who are your customers? Because your customer's not a demographic. Your customer is an individual. And so it's that always playing that balance game.
I totally hear what you're saying about having to move away from demographics to focus on the real individual needs that our customers and users have. And I also heard you mention the design thinking approach. Can you even tell our listeners and our viewers more about design thinking? Because sometimes when I talk to people, I hear, oh, hey, yeah, I heard, isn't that program that comes out of Stanford? And sometimes that's really what people know. So, for people who have no idea about design thinking, can you just give us like a really quick 101 on what it is we should know about design thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. And it did come out of Stanford. I learned at the D school at Stanford design thinking. So I also came out of Stanford. So I'm going to defend the Stanford, but it's basically, it boils down to, it's a human-centered design, or you could say user-centered design as well, if you prefer. But it's a cyclical design where you start with your user and you understand your user first through different tools, empathy mapping, persona profiles, or user profiles, and journey mapping. And then once you understand your user, now you start defining the problem that they have. Then you brainstorm what solutions you could provide, and then you do prototyping and testing, and you constantly cycle through all of those. So when you've got your first prototype and you want to test it, you go back to your user and you say, does this work for you? And the more people you can test it with, the better. But it is ultimately, does the design work for an individual? It's not, does it fit into a demographic?
I love how there's even these specific tools that you can use. So can you even tell us a little bit more about, for example, empathy mapping? What exactly is empathy mapping? I
Yeah.
know both those
So
words, empathy and mapping, but what happens when you put them together?
yeah. I just launched my first online course on empathy mapping, which everyone
Awesome,
can find
congratulations.
through the links. But so empathy mapping is a simple way of capturing information about individuals. And what you do is you take this map of what do they hear, what do they see, what do they say and do, what do they think and feel. So it's essentially the full environment inside and outside of their head, and inside outside if that's where it is, and you capture the highlights for an individual. So again, human centered. It's how they're seeing their world and how your product could fit into their world. And then you can take a whole stack of these and build not an average, but a representation. And sometimes you need to make more than one because you find out that a 20-year-old male is completely different than a 40-year-old male, but I want to hit both of those marketplaces. So I've got to design with both of them involved, because if I design it for that full 20 to 40, for the average, it doesn't work great for everybody. But if I design for an extreme, it's going to work for everybody. So the perfect example, and most design thinking courses will cover this, the OXO potato peeler was built. The company that built that, the gentleman, the designer, his wife was arthritic, and she was trying to peel potatoes with the classic metal stamp tiny potato peeler, and she couldn't grip it with her hand. He ended up taking it, shoving it into a bike grip. Now you got a big rubber handle. She can grab it just fine. The rubber means when you're working with potatoes and they're wet, less slippage. Amazingly enough, you and I, who are right in the middle, it works better for us too. But the metal one worked fine for us, but it didn't work for the extremes. He builds one for the extremes, and it works good for the middle. And so the empathy mapping, you're able to find where those extremes are and where those true insights are.
That's fascinating. I never really thought about that, of looking to, it's essentially almost the outliers to go to who the extremes are. Can you give us a couple other examples where that's been helpful to startups?
For startups, for sure. I think most startups, the MVP model is built for the extremes, because if you're building the minimum tasks, you have to have somebody in mind. You at least have to have an individual in mind somewhere. You can't build it for everybody, because then it's got too many features. So you find that beachhead market, or that extreme person that works for you, and you build your MVP for that person or that company. You find then, oh, it also works for a lot of other people. Slack, great example of that. The Slack team was building a video game. They needed to communicate internally. They were the extreme case because no other tool was working. And so they build this essentially a consistent IRC chat room, is always the way I looked at it. But it's the messages are always there, and they built it for themselves. They said, this is absolutely the tool because no other tool works for us. And then they started showing it to some friends, and all of a sudden, wow, it works for everybody. And now all kinds of industries are using it. I've seen it used in medical, aerospace, startups for sure use Slack, communities. And so they started with themselves as extreme users, and were able to build a tool that works for everybody. Now, whether or not Microsoft Teams is going to eat their lunch, different question that's coming up right now. But it's interesting that here it was, they were an extreme user, and they built what they needed, and it turns out, hey, a lot of people need this.
That's fascinating. I'm curious though, is there any way in which this approach of looking for the extremes ever goes wrong? Is there any kind of nuance, like something specific you should be looking for? What is the kind of insight that you're trying to get when you're looking at the extremes?
Well, and I think in particular, when we go back to the empathy mapping, part of the empathy mapping is section is what does my user say and do? And a lot of times it's contradictory.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they might say, I always look both ways before I cross the street, and then you follow them for a week. They never look both ways. Maybe they look one way. They just see the crosswalk and they go. So you want to look for those contradictions, and that's where it can go wrong if you go too extreme. And that's where doing a bunch of empathy maps or a bunch of persona creation helps you take out too extreme. I don't think this has happened, but I'm trying to think. He passed away, but Paul Allen has this massive yacht that they're now trying to sell, and no one's going to ever buy it. Well, someone will buy it eventually because the price will drop, but nobody's buying it right now because it was built for Paul Allen. He had all the money in the world, and you know, a childlike mind that created a boat with a submarine and multiple helicopters, and there's no market outside of him. And there's that danger, I think, especially for startups. Somebody is willing to cut them a check and they start building their tool for that person rather than trying to understand, is this a outlier or is this just an edge case? And I would argue an edge case is multiple people in that segment. You know, back to the OXO, a lot of people have arthritis, not just his wife. But Paul Allen, you know, one of the richest people in the world, he's an outlier. He's not a edge case anymore. He's beyond the edge. And it's hard to find that sometimes.
No, I think that's an excellent distinction too. The distinction between an edge case and an outlier. And you really want to be on that very edge. And I think that really is the challenge. Well, unfortunately, we're almost out of time, but Craig, let people know if they want to find out more about you, design thinking, empathy mapping, how can they connect with you?
Yeah, so the easiest, go to my website, soapboxrocket.com. That's got all the links. And the newest course I just launched, it's on courses.soapboxrocket.com, but it's links on the top too. So soapboxrocket.com has all the relevant links.
It's excellent. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing all this wisdom. It's definitely opened my eyes. I even just love this last distinction between the edge versus the outlier. I'm definitely going to go forward with that idea.
Yeah.
Try to apply that to my work. So thank
That's
you
great.
so much.
All right. Thank you. And I hope everybody has a great morning.
Yeah. Bye, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for joining us today. Please don't forget to subscribe, review, and share this show. If you'd like exclusive content and behind-the-scenes insight, for just $4 a month, you can support us at buymeacoffee.com. Now, go make it a great day. Ask me why.